You're listening in on an animated discussion about Superman the Animated Series with two experts in their fields. I'm Joshua Unruh, superhero scholar.
And I'm Caleb Masters, your friendly neighborhood film critic extraordinaire from the Metropolis.com. And today's topic is solar power. So Joshua, who knew Lois Lane would get her own archenemy? It's the coolest thing. I actually don't remember there being a part 2 to the Targets episode, but here we are. We got a follow-up episode I wasn't expecting, and you know what? It was pretty cool.
I really love that Leitner became a returning villain and that we both forgot that he had become a returning villain. I really am enjoying some of the surprise because I've seen this whole series. I own DVDs, which means I've owned them for a long time because otherwise I'd have Blu-rays, right? And I've watched them a lot and I still was like, oh yeah, Leitner's back and he's significantly more dangerous. And he's also mad at Superman now instead of Lois. Beautiful. Love it.
But I thought it was clever. He is mad at Superman instead of Lois, but yet he uses Lois as bait at the beginning of the episode, which I thought was clever. I was like, wait. And I even had that moment. I was like, wait, is this a follow-up to that episode we talked about not very long ago, in fact? And yes, it is.
And the answer is kinda. Yeah.
Different. He's got, I would say, much loftier goals this time around, though. He is no longer just a vendetta against Lois. He wants to take down Superman in style using a red sun, which is a really clever tactic, but we'll get to that. Joshua, I mean, he also had a new design that came along with it. What did you think of that?
Well, there's stuff to like and there's stuff that makes me just feel like it's a little undercooked, right? Like the stuff I really like is it looks like Kirby tech, you know, which is going to become more and more of a thing for this show as we introduce more fourth world stuff. You're going to see a lot more of that. And I just appreciate that when they have to show technology, they default to a Jack Kirby approach. That is great. But at the end of the day, it's still a bunch of orangey yellow stuff strapped on top of a gray bodysuit, and that's not exactly lighting my world on fire. I will say one thing I really appreciate is it's tied to the oversuit, the kind of prototype thing that he wore in his first appearance. Like they're not the same, but they are visually related. And that feels like a lot more thought than I would have normally expected going into these designs.
Right. I actually thought this was kind of a generic, though I think his gimmick is pretty cool. Using the light and reflections against Superman. Pretty clever, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I am in 100% agreement with you. It is too generic. It's just that the stuff that isn't generic is kind of made specifically to delight me. So it's like, all right, I'll curve this grade to a C, maybe a C plus, since I really like this episode a lot.
Passable. You know? Yeah, most definitely. Well, I mean, let's talk a little bit about this. I mean, firstly, I didn't even know he uses this sort of mirror technology to change the color of the sun's rays on the planet. I didn't know you could do that. I mean, you probably can't because this is, superhero cartoon. But I was like, hey, that actually tracks. That's pretty cool. And I like how it's a slow discovery to what's going on. Because initially Superman's like, why is this guy really getting one over on me? I'm Superman and I'm bleeding. What's going on? Oh, turns out the sun is red. How did he do that? I genuinely was like, how did he do that? This is just a guy. He's just a guy. He's not a supervillain. He has no real power. He's got technology.
Okay, let's dial in on some of that too, because first of all, I think that this is the first time we're seeing red solar radiation used as a weapon against Superman. I think that it's been used to like depower him in the main man, that was what kept him trapped alongside Lobo. So we've seen it used before, but I think this is the first time we've actually like sort of seen that weaponized, as opposed to just a containment. And I think that's a fantastic innovation. That really became a thing in the Silver and moving more into the Bronze Age. But in those eras, different colored stars had different effects on Superman. Not quite to the level that different colored kryptonites did, but like orange brought him down to 50% power. And, green did something I don't even know. Lots of different stuff. And then it settled into, well, no, it makes sense that if Krypton had a red sun, and it did, and it had a name, it was Rao, and they worshipped it once upon a time. If Krypton has a red sun and it's Earth's yellow sun, that's mainly the reason he gets his powers. Obviously, if he's under a red sun, he loses it. That is a little bit like a doggy door thinking to me. Like anybody could have come up with it, but somebody was the genius that went, wait just a minute.
Actually executed it.
Yeah. I love it.
I also love, there's even similar to the targets, like who is behind this? Who possibly could have equipped them? And Lois calls up Lex. And this is sort of like one of my favorite running ideas with Lex Luthor, specifically in Superman the Animated Series. His hands are never officially dirty. He's like, no, why would I equip this maniac with the power to destroy the planet just so I could get back at Superman? That's silly. I would never do that. And then...
Okay, hold on, Caleb. I wrote down the actual quote because I loved it so much.
And
okay. Especially Clancy Brown's delivery, which I am not going to be able to do, but I'll do my best. Lois, do you really think I'd jeopardize the welfare of the planet just to settle my personal grudge with Superman? And then he smirks because they're on the phone and she can't see him. Oh my God. It's delightful.
Isn't that also when he hits the target bullseye with the arrow too?
Yes.
It's so good. It's so good. I love it because he essentially was totally like, while Luminous was in prison, was giving him all this technology and research and was like, I had no idea that he would come up with this technology to destroy Superman. How was I to know? Classic plausible deniability from Lex. I love it.
So good. So good. It also shows, he specifically mentions how much money he's losing with his satellites being co-opted. But then immediately admits to us, the viewer, that he's the guy who's doing it. And I'm just like, he is willing to spend billions to maybe get somebody else to kill Superman. It's so good. It's excellent Lex business.
It really is. And again, my hypothesis is that he's the ultimate Superman bad guy because he's either creating or directly working with pretty much every threat to Metropolis in the show.
I think that there's a case to be made that this is another way that the businessman take on Lex can be an opposite number to Superman, because at the end of the day, he has a secret identity, right? I mean, Lex Luthor has a secret identity. If he's the one who's creating all of the problems for Superman, air quotes, by night, but by day, he is fine, upstanding businessman. This episode really made me see this version of Lex that is not my favorite as an opposite number for Superman in a way that no other version of Lex really can be. And that was neat. That was a real eye opener for me. Not to say this in a humble brag kind of way, but I don't have brand new thoughts about Superman and Lex very often anymore, So it's nice when I do.
Well, it's an age-old rivalry. It's one of the fundamentals of comic books, Joshua. So when you've been at it as long as you have, I imagine it's hard to find original ideas about Superman versus Lex. But again, I just think it was obviously not the center of the episode, but a very nice inclusion just to show exactly how that relationship works in the bigger picture.
Right. Leitner's dangerous, but who's really in charge here?
Exactly.
And he's in like one scene, and he's still the guy who's really in charge here. Lex Luthor, baby.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing we have to talk about with this episode, Joshua, and I loved it. It feels like ripped straight from a comic book panel. The Invisible Fortress. That was awesome.
Yes.
Oh, by the way, the Invisible Fortress that, surprising no one, turned out to be a LexCorp building or an abandoned LexCorp building. He had nothing to do with it. He was just using my building, my old building. Yeah, totally.
I mean, there is a lot of plausible deniability there if we remember the first episode. Like it's obvious to us that Lex did it, but this is a guy who was a whistleblower on Lex, and he's like, bygones be bygones, while you're in prison, let's let you work on some stuff and maybe get closer to parole or whatever. But on the down low, it's all like, I'm gonna need you to murder Superman. And he's like, done deal, buddy, done deal. Just give me access to your stuff. And he's like, okay, Lex says, just don't screw me over in the process. It's good. It is just shockingly on point with all of these characterizations and relationship interplays.
Yeah, right. And of course, I love it's a big invisible building. His hideout is invisible based on the sort of like the mirror power that he's been able to put out there. But also, once you get inside, once Superman gets inside, it is an old-time Western bar. It's a pirate ship. It's a railroad track. I love it. A lot of different environments.
Yeah. We have a depowered Superman who is even further outside of his comfort zone with these weird situations, right? And it's just enough. I mean, there's one way you could look at this, that Leitner is just sort of toying with him, and he is, but it's also part of the plan. Keep him off balance, attack him with things that might be solid and might not, put him in a Western saloon. He doesn't know what he's doing in a Western saloon. Everybody I've spoken to has memory holed this episode, I think including you and I. And yet, as I watched it, I was like, this is a really well put together episode. I enjoy this very much.
Now, again, it goes back to that sort of like the workman-like descriptor we've used in the past. Like, there's nothing super complicated here. It's just taking a lot of elements that work, and it's a good old-fashioned episode, one would say.
The part that I really like is that you've clearly got an evolution in terms of Leitner, right? We have moved from a guy who was willing to use technology to murder Lois Lane because he felt overlooked by her into some what I would call proper supervillainy, right? The phrase that kills it for me is when Lois is convinced that he's at the gondola to kill her, and he says, "I have bigger fish to fry, and you're just the bait." Okay, we have now leveled up, right? In a real supervillain way. We were introduced being angry at Lois, and we still don't like her, but the real problem is Superman, and I'm going to get him first. Like, there is stuff happening under the hood of this episode that nobody points out as happening. You know, the stuff with Lex's smirk, it's just left as subtext. Luminous kind of leveling up, both in terms of power, but also in motivation, an introduction of the Red Sun as a weapon, just a lot of really good stuff rumbling under the hood that turns this thing into a great episode for me.
Yeah, most definitely. And again, at the end of the day, I think one thing I find intriguing is that Superman is depowered for most of the episodes, so no really, power level check-in, so to speak. He is trying to figure out how to take on this opponent without the powers that he holds dearly. So, just overall, really well done episode.
Caleb, I can play a little bit of power check-in with you if you'd like.
Sure.
They change the order in which he loses his powers on this episode from the more traditional comic book approach.
Okay.
So it's just kind of fun. This is, kind of a power check-in. The way that this is usually dealt with in the comics is that a lot of the stuff that is very, very energy dependent, the most obvious being heat vision, but also the cold breath, are the first things that he loses when he's starting to be depowered by lack of yellow sun radiation or red sun radiation depowering him. That's the first stuff to go, is the high energy stuff. And the last thing to go is his invulnerability, because it's the most sort of latent or, running in the background of all his powers. And I don't blame them at all, because they wanted to make him very vulnerable in this episode. And let's point out, they really telegraph that, because much like Mask of the Phantasm, when our hero gets a bloody lip, it got real. Only times 10 for Superman, right? Yeah. So it's great. I don't blame them at all, but I just thought you would be entertained to know that they kind of turned that upside down a little bit from the more traditional comic book stuff.
Yeah, no. So the power level check-in is that he loses his powers in a certain order, not that he gained a new power or did anything incredible feat-wise. Again, Joshua, I think just the last thing I will say about this episode is that I really appreciate how Superman's most compelling enemies really are the ones who use their brains to identify his weaknesses. Because, Luminous is just a normal guy who has some technology and some wits about him. And that's really it. And it makes for a character who's able to apply pressure in some ways that actually feels like there's real stakes.
I agree with that 100%. And what I love about the upping of the stakes here is that it also ups the stakes for Jimmy and Lois when Superman is weakened. Because normally what we would expect is that he would put himself into more danger in order to save them. And in this case, he simply cannot. Like, that's not an option that's available to him. He has to beat the bad guy in order to save them, because he doesn't have the power to just run off and save them first. It's good. I really like it. It's a different flavor that Luminous, of all people, brings to the interaction with Superman. Okay, Caleb, before we close this out, I really wanted to circle back around to Lois and point something out about her that I really, really appreciated in this episode. Because it is easy to forget that Leitner was her villain first, right? After about the first third of the episode, we're off to a whole different set of races. But when we're first introduced to Lois in this episode, she is freaking out that Leitner's out of jail. But she can't handle it. She's just so nervous about it. She can't sit on her hands. And so in pure Lois Lane fashion, she runs toward the danger. I love it. And it's really summed up for me in the line when Clark is like, but what if he actually kills you? And she says, then you'll know who did it. Lois is an unexpected gem in this episode to me.
Yeah, again, I think highlighting her strengths, similar to the first episode, she has her moments where, as a reporter, she is going to go towards the danger for the best story, right? The curiosity is consistent.
It's just incredibly human to me, while also being extremely Lois Lane. You know, that the way of dealing with danger is to run towards the danger is the best Lois Lane description I've ever heard. All right, now that I've gotten my Lois Lane hero worship out of the way, Caleb, let's assume people have enjoyed Solar Power as much as you and I did. What else should people be watching, reading, playing, or experiencing?
Yeah, absolutely, Joshua. Well, with the sun playing such a major role in this episode, the first movie that came to mind was a little Danny Boyle film from the early aughts called Sunshine, in which the sun is expected to explode or burn out in a set amount of time. So the only way to stop, or I guess keep it going, is by sending an expedition into space to ensure that the sun stays on so that Earth may stay warm. It's a really, really great sci-fi film. Again, it's got sort of vibes from like Event Horizon and Alien. There's a little bit of space horror, but it's also a little more, I would say, purposeful and optimistic in the story it's trying to tell in those other two films. But it's really something really compelling if you're looking for great stories about the sun. Other stories about the sun, I just threw this in there because it has the name Daybreakers, but it's a little low-key sci-fi movie called Daybreakers. It's about vampires and vampires they've taken over the planet. They have won. They are now the dominant species. And oh wait, you mean they need human blood to survive? Oh, they're running out of human blood. Okay, so it's a story about what happens to the vampire society when they're running out of blood. It's really cool. It stars Ethan Hawke. It stars Willem Dafoe. Great cast. I won't say it's the greatest movie, but if you're looking for stories about vampires in the sun, it's a pretty good one. Check it out. Joshua, how about you?
Well, Caleb, you know that I try and stay away from more traditional sort of superhero recommendations in this space, and I've broken that rule a little bit, including our very last episode with a Batman cartoon because of the Batman cartoon we were watching. But in this case, I'm going to skirt my own line, and I am going to recommend The Shadow, the Alec Baldwin film from the 90s. And I'm going to claim that this does not, in fact, break my rule, because The Shadow is not a superhero. He's a mystery man. Nevertheless, there are two reasons that I'm recommending this movie. First of all, there is an actual invisible stronghold in it at the end for different reasons, but it's a very cool effect. And it just reminded me immediately of The Shadow when that happened in this episode. But also because this episode, in a real way, uses Superman's strengths against him, or it looks for his weaknesses that remove his strengths rather than just straight killing him, if that makes sense. And that's very much a thing going on with the opposite number villain to the Shadow. He's very much empowered in many similar ways to the Shadow, and therefore is able to turn a lot of the Shadow's methods and abilities back around on him in a way that's similar, reminiscent of, but different from what Leitner does here. That about wraps it up for this animated discussion. If you enjoyed this conversation and would like to join in, come find us on Twitter. Caleb is at CMastersTalk, and I'm at Joshua Unruh, and the hashtag is Animated Discussion. Caleb, where else can people find you?
Well, Joshua, I'm the editor-in-chief and a contributor at the Metropolis, a website that specializes in in-depth film critique and analysis. We publish in-depth essays, including our podcast, The Cinematic Schematic, on all types of films, and you can find those articles as well as the podcast at thecinemetropolis.com.
Remember that an animated discussion is a Pulp Diction Productions program and is 100% supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can keep this and our other shows in production, check out patreon.com/pulpdictionproductions. Show your support by pledging at Patreon or by leaving a great review on Apple Podcasts to make it easier for more people to find us and join in the discussion.
And of course, the links to Patreon, Apple Podcasts, our recommendations, and Twitter are all easy to find in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us for this animated discussion. Hey, Joshua, there is something noteworthy about this specific episode of an animated discussion. Can you guess what it is?
Well, I can guess, but can our listeners guess? I don't know. Friends, this is the 99th episode of an animated discussion, which means that our very next episode is a huge milestone, our centennial, and we'd like to involve you in that celebration.
That's right, Joshua. Our next episode is episode 100, which is, it's not super common that podcasts hit episode 100, and we're not necessarily here to pat ourselves on the back, but we do want to make it clear that we want to celebrate, and there's a few different things we're going to do to celebrate. Another really big part of this conversation is that we want to hear from you, the listeners. What has been your favorite episode that we've covered so far? What has been your favorite animated discussion episode? So maybe the actual episode we were talking about, not your favorite, but you enjoyed the podcast. What are some things that you agreed with us on, disagreed with us on? What are some pondering questions that you would like to hear us talk about? Well, we want to hear from you, the listeners. So you can send those emails to pulpdictionpress@gmail.com.
The link to that email will be in the show notes. So please hit us up and celebrate our 100th episode. And so until next time, look, up in the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane. It's an animated discussion.